Hi, everyone. Sorry, I guess it would help to unmute myself, but welcome, everyone. Um, just going to get started so that because we have a pretty busy schedule and that sort of thing, and a busy, agenda for today, I'd like to welcome you to the first of CAPA's patient partner skills development webinars that we're holding. This one is focused on preclinical and clinical research. And so, as you've probably noticed, as you've entered the Zoom space, I am recording this webinar, and so the intent is to kind of focus on the presenters and the sort of general Q&A at the end. But we'll be recording that and putting it on the CAPA website afterwards, and on our YouTube channel. We'll also be doing some takeaways after this, so sharing resources. So if you have anything to share, I know the presenters have things to share, and so we'll be making sure to capture those and putting them in some sort of short 1 to 2 page takeaway. So I just wanted to let you know we won't be personally identifying anybody. So just to hopefully make you hopefully you'll be comfortable with that. And if not, just feel free to message me directly at the end. Yeah, so that being said, I'd like to just sort of start with a land acknowledgement. I live, work, and play on the land, on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, or the Anishinaabe. I'm also trying to kind of do land acknowledgements in maybe a little more meaningful and reflective way. So I know myself, I feel, or I've learned, right, that we should be learning more about Indigenous history. And so I have kind of delved into that a little bit more on my own, and recently learned that, the Indigenous people where I grew up, the Haudenosaunee, actually helped send, over 100 warriors to Montreal to defend it against enemies and that sort of thing. So I just find it interesting to kind of learn about history from sort of the two sides of things. And it's not always something, at least, that I was taught, growing up and learning history in school and that sort of thing. So just wanted to share that little nugget of history, and while acknowledging how I live, work, and play on the land of the Anishinaabe here in the place known as Ottawa. So, in terms of our agenda for today, I'm trying to keep my introductions and that pretty short, because I'd like, us to spend most of the time hearing from Marie-Maxime Bergeron and Manoj Lalu, who will be doing the first presentation, and they'll have 20 minutes between them. Will also be followed by a presentation by Glenn Hazelwood, followed by sort of a general question and answer period. So, feel free, to turn your camera on, turn your camera off, use Zoom captions. This meeting is being captioned. Also encourage you to share comments in the chat, and I'll be looking at those as I moderate that Q&A, at the tail end of our webinar. So thank you all for that. And so with that, I'm just gonna, these are our speakers for today. I've had a lot of fun actually working with all of these people because I am first, well, I live with arthritis. Many of you probably already know that. So I've worked with Glenn Hazelwood on clinical practice guidelines for rheumatoid arthritis, which is the disease that I live with. I'm also a sepsis survivor. So living with arthritis makes you more susceptible to infection and these sorts of things. So this is where I've had the pleasure of meeting Marie-Maxime and working with her as a patient partner, and then also working with Manoj as a researcher. And so I put 3 stars here, 1 for each of you. And I'm really just going to pass it over to you, Marie-Maxime and Manoj, to introduce yourselves and get into things. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and make space for you.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm just going to bring up my slides here.
Thanks, Laurie.
Hopefully this works. I was telling Laurie that I had a Zoom meltdown at actually at the PXP conference. I don't know if any of you were at that conference, but it's a patient engagement in research conference, international one. So hopefully it doesn't happen today, but Laurie has backup slides if that happens, and Marie Maxime can take over. So, okay, so thanks, Laurie, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks for all of you for joining. I'm from Ottawa. Originally actually born and raised in Edmonton, but have lived in Ottawa for the last 15 years. I'm an anesthesiologist and a scientist there. I'm actually in Vancouver at Airbnb right now, though it's for the World Congress in Intensive Care, so a big sepsis conference actually internationally is taking place here right now. So I'll be leading off this session with just a brief, hopefully around 10 minutes, chat around patient engagement, first of all, and then moving into patient engagement in preclinical research. So I have a couple of polls, and I know Marie Maxime has one, and Glenn has a couple as well too. I think Laura's going to be setting this up in Zoom polls in the chat there. So the first question is, how familiar are you with patient engagement in research? So the options are A, I'm hearing about this for the first time. B, I've read or heard a little, but not much. C, I have some experience with it. D, I'm very familiar and actively involved. And then E, I could or already do teach the stuff. So I'll give you a, yeah, perfect. I just saw it pop up there.
Everybody should see it, and I can,
Yeah.
once we have, a good bit of participation, I'll close it off.
Great. Maybe we'll just give it another 15, 20 seconds, I guess, Lori.
Yeah, we're getting close.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got about 70% of people have completed it. So maybe just wait 5 more seconds. All right. All right, I'm going to end it and share the results.
Oh, okay, great. So we have some people who are very familiar, actively involved, and we have some folks that are in the A or B category, which is great. So we have a nice mix of people, and hopefully in the Q&A, those with more expertise can also share some of their experiences as well too. So with that being said, I thought we could just start with a definition of patient engagement. There's lots out there for those of you less familiar with the field. This one I really like. It's sort of a common sense, I think, approach to defining it. Is actually from an organization in the UK. And they say that patient engagement in research is research being carried out with or by patient partners rather than to, about, or for them. So in other words, patient partners are in the driver's seat along with the researchers in terms of studying questions. And you might ask, what do we mean by patients? Well, in Canada, when we're talking about patient engagement in research, it's actually a very broad term. Patient could mean anyone with a lived or living experience of a health condition, but it can also mean anyone in their circle of informal caregivers as well, so friends and family as well too. So it's a nice broad definition as to who's counted, quotes, as a patient in this space. So second poll question, where do you think your input could make the biggest difference in research? 4 options this time. A, choosing what questions to study. B, selecting outcomes that matter to patients. C, improving how studies are run. Or D, sharing results with the community. And for those of you with more expertise, you might say, this is difficult, but I just want you to choose one. Or maybe and speak for yourself, I guess, for those with some experience and expertise. So where do you think you've made the most difference, if you want to answer it that way as well?
All right. We got about 80% of people responding, so I'll just get 5 more
Perfect. Yeah.
seconds. and poll.
Great. So we have a number of people saying the option A and B, so choosing questions to study and selecting outcomes. Okay. And that's great. And I think those of you with expertise would probably agree with me when I say that in terms of the clinical research space, patient partners can definitely make a difference in all of these. And in fact, there's actually good empirical evidence, so studies that have been run where they've studied patient engagement to see what sort of difference it makes. And there's nice evidence, I think, for each of these that having patient partners on the research team really makes a difference. So that being said, I want to switch gears a little bit because Lori wanted me to concentrate more on the preclinical side. But before I define preclinical research, I thought we should just talk about types of biomedical research. This is, or I think a little bit overly simplified, but I think two broad categories: clinical biomedical research, where studies are involving human participants to evaluate health, disease, or medical interventions. And that's, I think, sort of a simplified definition. But in contrast to that, what I'll be speaking about is preclinical research, where the subjects that we're actually looking at are laboratory animals and cells. So in clinical trials, we're talking about human participants. In preclinical research, we're talking about research that is conducted on animals and cells, and they're really to study human health and disease. A couple of pictures there that I just generated from OpenAI. And you might be asking, how can patients be meaningfully engaged in preclinical laboratory research? I know Glenn and also Marie-Maxime will be speaking a bit about the clinical side, and Marie-Maxime will also be speaking a little about the preclinical side, where she's been involved with some of the work that we've conducted. However, there's actually a bit of a literature developing around this. It's a fairly new area in terms of thinking about preclinical laboratory-based patient engagement. And in fact, we conducted a systematic review in the area, last updated in 2021. We're actually going to update that this upcoming year. And at that time, we could only find 32 published examples. There's almost certainly more examples that were never published, but in thinking about things that were published in index where we could find them, we found 32 published examples of preclinical studies, again, laboratory-based studies using animals or cells to study a human health condition. And they had involved patient partners in some form. So across the bottom here, you see the different phases that patient partners were involved in this particular research. So you can see education, funding, priority setting, study design. So nice examples of that. And if you add up the numbers, they actually add up to more than 32 because some of the studies actually had patient partners involved in more than one way. And then we see the next bar appearing a dissemination of results, so sharing with the community, in other words. What's very interesting there is that there were no examples of data collection or data analysis, which is perhaps not completely surprising because when we're thinking about preclinical research, it's done in a laboratory and basically it's behind closed doors. In my institute, for instance, it's actually key carded as well too, so there's security measures. And for anyone to actually step into the lab, student, patient partner, et cetera, there's a number of courses and certifications that are required. So there are these barriers that we need to overcome. However, that being said, our group, and I've got a slide at the end just pointing to our website, labpartners.ca, but our group is trying to work through this with a international collaboration. It's Canadian-led, where we're trying to bring more patient partners on board to preclinical research. So to end off, I just have three quick case examples that I hope might inspire some of you to think about this a bit further. So the first one I really love. This is by far and away my favorite example. This is Dr. David Weinstein. He is a scientist, American, and I would say he was really a pioneer in this area of preclinical patient engagement. He studies glycogen storage disease type 1A, which is a newborn metabolic disease. And in the early 2000s, he had a patient partner role. So this is a newborn health condition. So these are parents that would be coming through and families that would be coming through the lab. And you'd be showing me, hey, this is what we're doing in our lab. Sort of lab tours, very typical. You see this in many institutes these days as well, too. And at the end of one of these semi-regular tours, he decided, oh, why don't I sit down with these folks and see what they think about what we're doing in our lab. And he was very surprised with this discussion because all of the parents said, yeah, it's fantastic. You're working towards a cure. We also recognize this is going to take many, many years to get to. Can you, in the interim, make a better current treatment? And the current treatment at the time was an oral supplement that you had to give every few hours. So you can imagine that's very, very disruptive to families and very disruptive to these children as well, too, waking up in the middle of the night, disrupting family activities to give this oral supplement. And he said, okay, actually, that's probably something we can do is a pretty simple oral supplement. And what he did is he moved some of his lab funding over to creating this, and they were able to produce a long-acting or slow-release oral supplement. And that was actually FDA approved in 2009. And speaking to Dr. Weinstein, we actually interviewed him. He said he would have never even thought about this. had you not sat down and had this discussion with these families? So second case example is a preclinical systematic review that my group led. It was focused on stroke, and we had 8 patient partners. 7 of them are co-authors on this paper that I'm showing here. And we actually went through the preclinical literature on this particular agent to treat stroke. And again, preclinical meaning we were focused only on the animal studies where they had used this agent to try to treat stroke. We found some really interesting results, but the take home here for this group is that we actually had the patient partners choose the topic. We gave them a range of topics that we could actually study, and this preclinical systematic review has reviewed all this literature. They suggested outcomes. They actually even helped us screen studies, extract data, and they helped with interpretation as well too. So that was a pretty exciting project. We did this over a course of a year. We met monthly as well too. And then finally, Marie-Maxime is going to be touching on this as well too. But we have a collaborative group. These are the 6 core laboratories. It's actually larger than this across the country. But we're all studying sepsis, which is life-threatening infection. And we have all come together to use one animal model of sepsis to try to standardize what we do in labs a bit better and be able to share results and compare results between our laboratories a bit better. It's a bit difficult now the way we typically do these sort of studies. So within our National Preclinical Sepsis Platform, which is the name for this collaborative, we actually have a patient panel. Lori's a member of it. Marie-Maxime is going to be speaking in a moment here, and she's a member as well too. They're invited to join all of our lab meetings as they occurred over the 3 sort of core years where we drove forward all these studies. We actually just finished everything a few months ago in the fall, and we've shared results with everyone as well too. But it was really great to have them. They joined the meetings that they could. We actually picked up some of the outcomes that they suggested in our final laboratory study as well too. And again, this is a mouse model of sepsis that we're using. So that was, again, just a third example of how we've had, I think, meaningful patient engagement where patient partners have certainly helped guide the direction of our research itself. So with that, I'll hand it over to Marie-Maxime.
Thank you, Manoj. So hi, everyone. It's particularly special today to be sharing my story because we are in September, and September is Sepsis Awareness Month. So for me, it's always brings a lot of emotion every year as how can I make a difference. Also, just feeling the gratitude that I've survived this episode, which happened 6 years ago. And as you see on the picture here, I have my second daughter, Celeste, in my arms. On this picture, she was a newborn, but the actual episode happened 13 months after she was born through breastfeeding. And like a busy mom, you know, you kind of ignore signs and you're busy working and trying to juggle everything. And I had signs that I was ignoring, like pain on my breast, even a blister. But it was the first time that it never happened. So for me, I just thought, you know, it's going to go away, or I'll eventually consult if it gets worse. But one day, maybe 4 or 5 days after this signs started happening, I just woke up really like with excruciating pain in the middle of the night with some fever and flu-like symptoms. And I'm a registered dietitian, so I was supposed to be scheduled to work that day. And I was lucky enough to just call the clinic, and I got an appointment offered. But honestly, I wouldn't have gone to see the doctor if it wasn't an appointment that was offered to me. So I canceled my patients for the day, and I took all my energy and went to my appointment. And as I took the stairs to the clinic, I collapsed. And at that point, the doctors obviously didn't know what was happening. They saw that I had an enlarged breast. I was vomiting. They thought maybe, you know, had a gastroenteritis. But it's when the actual first respondents, it came to the clinic to bring me to the hospital. Saw that my pressure was very, very low. And it's at that point that I guess all the alarms went off, and they rushed me to the hospital. When I got there, I was already in septic shock. And I was put into the ICU within 12 hours. So they kind of figured out what was happening without knowing what type of bacteria had gone through my system. But luckily, that was isolated quite fast, which was invasive strep A. And I was also lucky that I didn't have to get surgery done because I was part of the plan. It was to remove my breast, so that wasn't necessary. But then I thought that I was going to be fine because in the whole process, I was very aware of what was happening. But then that's when a wall hit. And through the ICU, I had pneumonia, I had multiple organ failure, and I basically came out of the ICU 6 days later. It's traumatizing. I came out okay because a lot of people actually get amputated, obviously pass away and have really, really severe aftermath. But in my case, I had to, pick up where I left off, meaning being a mom, taking care of my kids, trying to nourish myself, try to gain all the muscle that I had lost. And that's at the same time when I realized, like, how come I didn't know the signs? How come I didn't even think this could be possible with breastfeeding? Being that, I have good support systems and I know how to cook and buy healthy foods, how can people that don't have this luck be even able to survive or recuperate after such an ordeal? So this kind of drove me to share my story and get involved as a patient partner. There was also another reason, which was that 3 months after this episode, and that was around September, I actually had a severe PTSD episode. Obviously, this was such a big shock that it affected me deeply, and this is really what pushed me to go on Facebook and start sharing my story and make connections. And this is kind of how my patient partner story begins. Next slide, please. So let's take a pause. And I'd like to know if you can answer, what is the guiding principle for successful patient engagement? We have inclusiveness, support, mutual respect, co-building, and another option would be all of the above.
All right, I'm going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. There you go, Maddie Nixon.
You guys are awesome. It's yeah. I mean, we see that there's many facets to patient engagement, and it's very, very important that we get the inclusivity and the diversity. I unfortunately represent maybe the majority of patient partners in Canada. There's studies that were driven, and it's mostly women that are engaged. But we're really working towards that by maybe getting more support for minorities. That's part of the framework now, is have diversity in the engagement, but also how. Also encouraging mutual respect, to really value each other's perspective, also to really co-build as a team. So all these elements are from the SPORE framework, but there's many frameworks out there. So we kind of understood now how I became a patient partner. It was really like an urge to make a difference, to also maybe, in retrospect, to heal from the experience. So the first step for me, and I think for most patient partners, would be to just share their story. In my case, at the time, there was only Facebook as a support group. So this is where I kind of make my connections. And that got me to engage with the University of British Columbia, where we actually created a patient council. That was 6 years ago, through the pandemic. And from this experience, we actually drove a case study to really look at the impacts of engagement and recovery. Through the whole process of the last 6 years as well, I went through many patient partner roles. And this brings me to talk about the NPSP, what Manoj was discussing, which really sparked my curiosity at first when I was approached. I wanted to know more about preclinical studies, but also really, how can I make an impact? This seems so foreign, it seems so far, but this is actually even more of a reason as a patient partner to engage, because the studies are made in laboratories. The scientists need to hear the voices of the patients and understand the why behind what they're doing. So it was very, very fulfilling to be part of that that study. And we did other things as well, not just the actual study that Manoj was talking about, but I was able to also deliver a workshop, and I had a chance to visit also a lab at the McMaster University. This also brought me to get more and more training. So as this progressed, I felt the need to know more on how to engage, and even brought me to pursue a master's degree in education. So being that I'm a registered dietitian, I'm in healthcare, but I want to really learn how to deliver the right proper tools to help sepsis survivors like myself on maybe how to eat better and how to recover. So this is what drives me now to pursue this master's degree. And this is the team that I had such a pleasure working with. And there's a panel, I think, Manoj, that you'd like to discuss a bit, or we already talked a little bit at first, but I think there's a big incentive that we worked on this summer, right?
Yeah, so we basically got the panel together and plus other patient partners as well too. So there were 8 patient partners in total. We went through a priority setting exercise. It was actually funded by our university and also funded by CIHR, our largest federal funder as well too. So that was really interesting because you hear about priority setting exercises in the clinical space all the time, and patient partners are always part of that, or they should be always part of that. And in the preclinical space, as far as I know, no one's actually done this before. So we're just wrapping that up right now. We created a top 10 priority list with Marie Maxime and other patient partners input as well too, which has been great. So we now have a top 10 list for Canadian sepsis research in laboratories. And I think this is the last slide here. So this is our lab partners website. I think if you scan on that QR code, it'll go there. We have a couple of policy briefs if those of you that are less familiar with patient engagement. The audience, I'll just warn you for those policy briefs, you'll see there are not patient partners necessarily, but it gives you a flavor of what's happening in the early clinical trial phase space. So phase 1, phase 2 trials and trying to get patient partners involved in that. And that's a space that our group is very interested in. And obviously preclinical, which you spoke about just now as well too. There's a policy brief there. If you look across the top, there's resources that are geared towards patients, researchers, and organizations. So you can explore those at your own leisure if you like. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, you two. Lots to sort of, reflect on and absorb and that sort of thing. So I encourage folks, and thank you so much, Maddie Maxim, for sharing your experience. I know it's never easy talking about things, regardless of how many times I'm sure you have. And yeah, these are like life-changing moments, that's for sure. So thank you for that. Anyways, and with that, so I ask everybody to like add any questions or comments in the chat. I'll be looking at those like for the last little bit, but I'm really just going to pass it right on to Glenn, who he can do his presentation. So again, I will reconfigure people here.
Okay, thanks, Lori. That was an excellent talk. So thank you both. I'm Glenn Hazelwood. I'm a rheumatologist in Calgary and do research in the clinical space, a lot of research in rheumatoid arthritis, looking at outcomes, different research methods. I have a particular interest in patient preferences and clinical practice guidelines, and have had the pleasure of working with CAPA, Lori, and Dawn for a number of years. So I'm going to jump right in. And my main objective of this talk is to really hopefully convey why patient input is so critical when we're developing clinical practice guidelines and health policy. And I'll go through some different examples that I think highlight that. I want people to know how guideline groups and policymakers should be considering patient preferences. So when you're reading a recommendation or health policy document, did they do sort of a good job of including patient perspectives? And then really, I consider myself less of an expert than Lori in terms of how to get involved with research. So really looking for stories from you guys in terms of how you can get involved, because it's not always easy, especially at the health policy level. So I just wanted to start off with a poll, and this is from a real research example. So these are two pain medications for rheumatoid arthritis. There's the green bar and the orange bar. The axis is the events for 100 patient years. So this is the chance of you getting that side effect or adverse event if you took the medication for 100 years, or you can think of 100 patients taking it for a year, what's the chance of you get it? And there's two bad events. One is a major adverse cardiovascular event, which is a heart attack or stroke, and you can see the risks there. The other one is a gastrointestinal event, and that is a major bleeding event where you'd have to be admitted to hospital, maybe ICU, and get treatment to fix it. So just a poll. The first poll is, what would you prefer? And just open it up to the audience, the green medication or the orange medication, if these were the two choices you had.
All right, I'm going to close it in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, so kind of split more towards green. I'll open it up again, but this time, what if the green medication worked 20% better to control your pain? What would you choose? We were already leaning towards green for most people, but just curious to see.
Okay, in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, so we shifted even more. So it's interesting because I've done this to different audiences, and anytime I present it to patients, it's way more towards green. When I present it to like medical students or healthcare practitioners, it tends to be more orange. But green was Vioxx, and so Vioxx was a medication, I don't know if everyone remembers, it was pulled from the market, and it was pulled from the market because of that study, because there was a higher risk of cardiovascular events with the study, even though it protected against GI events. And it was kind of an interesting story because there was a big outcry from patient groups at the time, because a lot of people found Vioxx was the only medication that worked for their pain. It didn't work for everyone, but the people who were taking it and it was effective for were really upset that it was pulled from the market. And it was sort of just at the start of my medical training. You heard stories of patients sort of hoarding boxes of Vioxx as it was taken off the market so they could keep using it. And this was a study, this is an association. I don't know if people read the quote before, that was sort of something I just found on the internet. But around the time, this is showing sort of the non-opioid medication use versus opioid medication use. And around the time of when Vioxx was pulled off the market, opioid prescription use went up in people with MSK conditions, and Vioxx and related medications to Vioxx prescription rate went down. So you can kind of ask, you know, what was that the right policy decision at the time? This is another example, and this comes really, I think a lot of, I know Lori is very aware of this because we worked on this together. I'm sure others on this chat are aware, may be aware of this, but this was when COVID vaccines first came out. Anyways, trying to remember what time that was, but this was the initial recommendation that NACI, which is the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, made for people with autoimmune conditions taking immune suppressant medications. And they said you shouldn't, if you have one of these conditions, you should not get the vaccine. And so many people, us, lots of patient groups, most practitioners, I would say, and patients thought that was didn't make a lot of sense. And so what we did is we set out to review, okay, what is the evidence that we have that can inform this decision? And one of the issues was people with autoimmune conditions were not part of the trials, the COVID vaccine trials. We now have good data because you know, the vaccines have been out there, but at the time we were just sort of left with the major trials. And so we looked at all the data from the trials to see how effective the vaccines were. And then we looked at all trials on other vaccines to see if there's any concern with vaccines in general. And the issue was that vaccines can sometimes cause flare-ups of autoimmune disease. It's not common, but that was the risk. And what NACI had said is because people with those conditions weren't part of the trials, there could be a risk of flare, and therefore we should recommend against these vaccines. And so what the data said, this is the data at the time, is that we knew these vaccines were very effective. And yes, they may be less effective in people taking immune suppressants. And there's data from other vaccines that we use to inform that. And there was a theoretical risk of flare. But there's a lot of indirect evidence on because these were new vaccines, the initial trials didn't show huge numbers of autoimmune risks with these vaccines. And we know that vaccines are, you know, generally safe in people with these conditions. And so where patient preferences came in, and this is part of the guideline process, is that people told us, well, you know, obviously this was a major event. People were, you know, understandably very fearful of COVID, people with autoimmune conditions and without. What patients on the panel, the guideline panel, told us is that, well, this is a large benefit, potential benefit that's out there with these vaccines. And yes, there's this potential risk, but we consider that to be much less important than the benefit that the vaccines offer. And so it was really that weighing of the risks and benefits where the patient input was critical and is critical when making recommendations. And I think this statement really highlights, sort of summarizes that, is that the willingness to tolerate risk of flare was expected to be high given the expected benefits of vaccination. So even though we didn't have good information at the time, patients were telling us, we want to take that, you know, we're willing to accept that risk of flare because these vaccines can protect us against critical illness. And this really led us, we worked with guideline methodologists and Canada is actually one of the leading countries on guideline methods and patient engagement in guidelines. And that really led us to be able to make this recommendation for the vaccines when they came out. And we had a bunch of research agendas that were part of that. One is better data in people with autoimmune conditions, and we now have that. Another research agenda was, well, what are people's preferences and values around vaccination? And so we worked together. I worked with Dawn and Lori on this study, and then a number of other investigators. And we went out and measured people's preferences. So what were people's willingness to accept, you know, an unknown risk of flare at the time? And it really supported what we heard on the guideline panel, is that people were they wanted the benefits of the vaccine and they were willing to accept, you know, some risk of flare that came with that. And we now know that the risk of flare can happen after vaccines, but it's very low. But this was at this time, we didn't have good data, but this is what patients were telling us. I do a lot of work in guidelines. One of the things I hear a lot is every patient is different. So how can we use patient preferences in guidelines? Because everybody is different and everybody has their own preferences. And what I say to counter that is, yes, that's true. As we showed with the COVID vaccine example, understanding patient preferences still helps us make a recommendation, because policymakers and physicians, there's lots of evidence out there that we're not good at knowing what matters to patients and how patients weigh up these risks and benefits. And the other place it comes in is the variability in preferences is really important when we're making policy decisions and guidelines. And I just want to show a couple examples of that. Before I get to those examples, there's a really good talk, TED talk actually by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if people like his work. He has quite a few good books out there. But this one I don't think is in any of his books, and it's worth a listen. And it's a story of, I think it was back in like the 1970s, where two spaghetti sauce companies, Prego and Ragu, were competing for market share. And Ragu was winning, and Prego couldn't understand why, because when they went out and asked people what they wanted in a spaghetti sauce, the best spaghetti sauce they had was a good hearty chunky spaghetti sauce, and they couldn't understand why they were losing market share. And so Malcolm Gladwell tells a story where they hired this market researcher, and he actually went out and did research on patients and asked them what they preferred and looked at the variability. And what he found was that actually a third of patients preferred a spicy sauce, a third of patients preferred a hearty sauce, and a third of patients preferred a more typical sauce. And this really was one of the drivers, at least according to this story, and it's a good story, of now when you go into the grocery store, you see 50 different spaghetti sauces because everybody's different. And so what they realize is that they should have been looking for the perfect spaghetti sauces, and that people are different, and that understanding this variability, that not everyone is the same, can help you understand choices. And I think there's a lot of parallels to medicine. And I really like this quote, is that there's a movement in medicine. I think this summarizes precision medicine very well. From the search of universals, so one treatment that works is the best treatment for everybody, to understanding variability, both in terms of how treatments work, but also in terms of how what people's preferences are. This was a study that I think shows that nicely, looking at reducing medication in people who have rheumatoid arthritis. And this was a qualitative study we did. And what we found is people's preferences varied widely. So some people would never want to reduce their medication. Other people probably have already reduced their medication and haven't told their physician about it. And then people are in the middle. So what does that mean when we come to making a recommendation? And what that means is what we really need to do is to support individual variability in decisions. So that led us to sort of co-developing this decision tool to help, not everybody should be reducing their medication, but some people may want to, and how can we support them in making that decision? So where do patient roles come into drug policy and guidelines? This is a very oversimplified view, but essentially we really need patients to tell us what are the important questions and what are the important outcomes. It's really the job of the guideline panel and the research experts to then go and find the evidence, summarize that evidence as best as possible. And then we really need patients to tell us, okay, based on the evidence we have, what's the best treatment out there? Or is there more than one? Or what are how should we be thinking about the trade-offs that are out there? This is now, fortunately, if you look at sort of old guideline methodology, there's really no mention of patient roles in it. Fortunately, that's changed. So GRADE is probably the leading guideline method. And it's really right in the definition of what a recommendation is. So GRADE has two recommendations, a strong recommendation and a weak or conditional recommendation. What a strong recommendation is the benefits vastly outweigh the risks. So pretty much every patient would want that treatment. A good example is actually in sepsis. Antibiotics for sepsis is a strong recommendation because it's clear that the benefits outweigh the risks. But in a lot of conditions, there's lots of options now. And a lot of, in chronic conditions are living in this conditional recommendation space where there might be more than one option that's appropriate for people. How do we get patient preferences in health policy? That's a harder task, I'll admit, and I'd be interested in hearing people's perspectives. There is increasing recognition, this is a quote from an FDA document, that, and I won't read it out loud, I'll let people read it, but it really comes to that Vioxx question, is what do you do in a situation where maybe a treatment has really good benefits, but there is some risk associated with it? And there's an increasing recognition that we should be doing a better job of engaging patients and understanding how they view these risks when making decisions. So why should you get involved? One is really, patients are needed. We know that policymakers and physicians are not the best judge of patient preferences and values, and policy errors can happen. And I just wanted to finish with another example related to CAPA. This is a study, and ignore the sort of complexity of the different dots, but essentially what we did is we did another one of these preference studies, and this is looking at do people want an mRNA COVID vaccine or a protein subunit COVID vaccine? And then we looked at the variability between people. And what we found is there's a lot of people don't care which they get. And this is now well into the pandemic. So this is people have already had experience typically with the mRNA vaccines. But there's subgroups. We found a group of people that really want an mRNA vaccine, but then another group of people who really want a protein subunit vaccine. And so what does that imply? It really implies that we should be giving people options. If people have that strong preferences, there's something driving it, and that having vaccine choice available to people is important if we want to promote uptake. This story was really informed by Linda. So Linda, I'm assuming most people involved with CAPA know Linda, but she has a really nice story in the CBC that came out last year, where really talking about that she was getting flares. She gets flares with the mRNA vaccines, and so had to go to the US to seek out a protein subunit vaccine because it wasn't made available in Canada. Finally, how do you get involved? I think these webinars, Laurie, that you're doing are great. Linking with a patient group, I think, is the best way to, if you want to get involved in guidelines and health policy, to speak to other people who've done it. Really feel empowered. Really, people you are the one that lives with the condition and takes a treatment. So really, your voice should be heard in when we're making these decisions. And that's it. Thank you to funders and CAPA, who've had the pleasure of working with for a long time.
So much, Glenn. And I know we're getting a little short on time, but that was great. Sorry, I'm just going to add our other panelists here to the Q&A part of the session. But yeah, I didn't really plan it out that way, but between the increased risk of infection and then your talk on vaccines, I think it really kind of highlights some of the challenges, of course, that we live with as folks who are immunocompromised, right? And perhaps explain some of the variability, right? And some of the ways or reasons people have different preferences for different things. So thank you for that, Glenn, and thank you to the rest of our panelists. I know, and there's some great links in the chat and that. There was a question, and I would invite this person if they want, I think with vaccine choice, do we support this with good information? I don't know if that was a question about, some of the vaccines, or if that person wants to come on and clarify the question in any way, because I'd like to address their comment if we can. Or no pressure. This is an informal group, so we're not we're not too worried.
Laurie, I can maybe talk a little bit about that. I don't know if
Sure.
will answer the question, but I think, yeah, I mean, the basis of good decisions is good evidence. So that's kind of number one. We really need the research studies to tell us what the risks and benefits are. So, you know, none of the advocacy for more patient input on guidelines is to take away that evidence piece. That's a critical thing when we're, you know, so we're looking at vaccines. Yes, we need the best evidence we can on both types of vaccines. But then the sort of point about patient preferences that I think is missed a lot in health, you know, health policy groups is it's not the only thing we need. We need patient values to weigh up where we have more than one option and it's not clear what's the best. That's where the patient voice is really, really critical. And having choices is really important where you have a lot of variability in what people's preferences. So I don't know if that answered the question directly. And then, yeah, so that was one of the issues, and is an issue in Canada, is that the sort of where you don't have, where one option isn't available, it kind of leaves some people, with
with limited options. And in terms of some of, like, I can speak as the patient partner sort of involved in some of it too, was, you know, sometimes I sit there and I mean, I don't know myself, you know, in terms of some of the trade-offs and often the way we get information. I think to your point around, you know, how do we digest this information and make the best choice for us at the end of the day? And I think that's why, you know, well, first of all, if I'm sitting there and super unsure, I'm going to let the panel know that, right? Like, in terms of that variability is indeed, super important, right? For them to understand, because it does inform how the recommendation is made, right? And that's kind of what I felt was sort of my responsibility, I guess, as the patient partner there to, you know, some cases, you know, it's very tailored and customized. And so it also led us to develop some of those decision aids with Glenn. It helps people digest the information, right? And digest the evidence in a way that hopefully can help them at the end of the day to make the best decision around vaccines in that particular case. But Glenn, you're also leading work to do that with a lot of the other recommendations as well, right? For the rheumatoid arthritis guidelines. And so there'll be decision aids to kind of support that and help folks, you know, make the right choices for them. You know, it's like, you know, even on the tapering, you know, there'd be moments where I could not see myself tapering anything. And then other cases where I'm like, oh, maybe that would be nice if I didn't have, you know, so even as an individual, there's that variability. So anyways, all that being said, there's another question in the chat too. Are there any reliable resources out there on how to be engaged in care, how to tell our stories effectively and without potential re-traumatization, how to not be tokenized, how to not have sort of imposter syndrome, right? And not feel like we belong, I guess, in these spaces. So I don't know if anybody's open to trying to answer some of those questions.
Could maybe start.
Sure.
Perhaps to engage with experienced stakeholders, that could be maybe a good way to start, so they know to create that safe environment. Also, maybe going through training, that in itself is empowering, and that could encourage feeling less of the imposter syndrome, even though I think it always stays. But you will feel more confident that way. So I was just maybe just going with that at first, and the more you share, I think the more you feel empowered, and that goes away with time, and the benefits of the recovery will kind of kick in.
Lori, I don't know if you want to comment on the IMHA modules.
Yeah, or feel free if you want to.
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, I think you could probably provide sort of a more recent perspective on that, right? But I would say that for our research group, our students and staff that are involved in projects where patient partners are helping, they all take the IMHA modules, and I've heard good things about the Porch modules as well too. But again, I think I don't know if it totally speaks to what Jenny was asking there in the chat.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think like we've developed like those in the IMHA is short for the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis, which is why I guess there's an acronym from IMHA, which is kind of the main funding body for arthritis, right? And like federally, it's through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So they've done some great work. There's some great resources there on their PXP hub as well, if you're looking to sort of delve into things. But I know CAPA as an organization, like we've developed sort of tried to connect and create a bit of a learning portal for patient partners as well. So if you do want to get involved, you sort of can learn on your own. We also have a network kind of in the background, and that's kind of who, we were hoping to sort of address this sort of training to at the end of the day, that are involved. And I actually, for example, like we have some new folks that are going to be working with Glenn as I kind of step back from that and try to open up opportunities for others. So Glenn will be working with 2 new patient partners because we are often um, approach to see how people can identify people that might want to contribute to this sort of thing. And yeah, and kind of to that point, and I know we're coming up on time in that, but we are also offering another webinar next month, which is actually more patient focused. So maybe kind of talk to Jenny, connecting with others, and maybe talk about some of those things like how to tell our stories effectively, to connect on perhaps a different level and perhaps more as peers, as opposed to, like this is good to show all the possibilities, but I think I found that connecting with other people like me or who have similar experiences has been particularly helpful. So,
Lori, is there something like Sepsis Canada's lifting program, which Marie Mexico is part? Is there something like that in the arthritis space?
yeah, there's not just not that I'm aware of. Like, I mean, Kappa actually evolved from kind of a similar-ish thing through the Canadian Arthritis Network years ago. And I know that's, a lot of trainees kind of came up through that and were sort of introduced, kind of like lifting, but nothing as of now. Like, so we're kind of it as well, in terms of trying to, encourage that. And of course, Arthritis Society tries to encourage, that's another opportunity to get involved through grant reviews there and that sort of thing. So just looking through here, yes, we will provide, there's a question just about getting links to the different educational resources. So most definitely we'll summarize that in sort of some takeaways. So I'm definitely taking note of all of the resources shared, as well as some of them noted in the presentation. I know Manoj, you've shared some, and thank you, Mary, for sharing the MHA training as well. So we will most definitely do that. And I think with that, I might actually just kind of go back to some closing slides. Well, actually, first of all, want to just thank everybody for participating. There's an evaluation survey, because I know we're coming up on the hour. So please do complete this, share your views about this webinar, about maybe some ideas for future ones as well. If you could do that, just to see how we can offer something like this perhaps next year, or maybe an adapted version of it. So please do share your feedback there. I am just going to share the final slide too, just with our next webinar. So here is the survey example. So you can, also, I put it in the chat, but you can also use the QR code here. Feel free to connect with us and, share, or if you're interested in getting involved or even just learning information about CAPA. Our next webinar, what we're calling the patient room, is going to be more of an informal chat and learn for patient partners. So if you want to attend, hear from Linda, who, Glenn spoke of it ever so briefly in his presentation, who's been involved in advocacy and research too as a patient partner for, going on, I think 30 plus years at this point, as well as Therese Lane, who is quite passionate about health equity and brings that sort of equity and diversity sort of perspective to her work and her involvement as a patient partner. So I think you'll get some really great perspectives there. And also encourage, if you are interested in supporting our Coffee for CAPA campaign, that you can do so. We're a small not-for-profit, so for each of the bags of coffee that you buy, we'll get a portion of the proceeds. So anyways, with that, I will close off on the hour here. And really thank you, Manoj, Maddie, Maxim, and Glenn for coming in and sharing your perspectives on this, sharing some of your wisdom and all the possibilities that are possible for getting involved as a patient partner. So a big thank you to you all.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks, Lori.
All right, thank you.